5, 6, 7, 8.
Hey EXers, welcome to the EX Podcast episode number 53. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I'm here today with you because we need to shake things up in the world of HR, talent acquisition, recruiting, and company culture in order to create positive employee experiences in our organizations. Your workplace doesn't have to be a dreadful place where employees feel disengaged. This podcast brings a different lens to the HR, employee engagements, and company culture conversation. We approach these topics from a brand and customer experience angle rather than a traditional HR angle. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to share best practices on the key elements that foster employee engagements and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create these positive employee experiences. Not every company can do what Airbnb or Google do around their employee experience. And this is what this show is all about. Sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or a large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is Chris Byers, the CEO of Formstack, a tech company headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana, but with almost an entire remote workforce. Today with Chris, we talk about how he made the transition from a fully office-based workforce to an almost entire remote workforce, how he keeps employees engaged and connected when they all work remotely, how he's been able to humanize a digital workplace, what metrics and processes he's put in place to ensure that everyone is accountable for their work, why a remote culture is about trade-offs, and which attributes he looks for in candidates, and how the company handles the hiring and onboarding process. This episode is brought to you by Fusion Alliance. Fusion Alliance delivers holistic solutions fusing together data, digital, and technology to redefine customer experiences and move your ideas to execution. That's why businesses across multiple industries have relied on Fusion's expertise and partnership for over 25 years. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Chris. If you get the chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at @EX_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the EX Podcast. Today's guest is Chris Byers. He's the CEO of a company called Formstack, headquartered in Indianapolis, but with mostly the entire workforce working remotely. So Chris, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Tell us a bit more about what is Formstack and what's your background?
Yeah, so Formstack has been around for about 12 years, and we started in 2006, and the basic idea was how do you help people build a web form, and in 2006 that was kind of difficult to do. If you were not a developer, that's likely where you would need to go to get that job done, and so we wanted to make it easy for the non-technical user to build a form, and eventually that became pretty common in a lot of software, and so we transitioned to helping people collect that data and then put it in the right back-end system. So, the rise of integrations came in, 2010, 2011. And so now you can take that data, easily get it into Salesforce or MailChimp or drop a file in Dropbox or process a payment. And so, again, one of those areas where you likely would have needed a developer And even today, integrations are a lot easier. And so where we've gone with the platform is this kind of collaborative data collection where, we're all doing a lot more collaborative work these days. And so you often need multiple people to participate in some sort of data collection. And so a great example of that would be, a very simple example, a reimbursement form where you've gone on some business and you used your personal credit card. You need to put that in a reimbursement form that gets sent to your manager, who needs to maybe provide, it was associated with this project and I'm approving it. And then it goes on to the AP department who makes the payment. And then maybe they code it to some specific code. They send that back to you. And then you learned, I'll get paid on my next paycheck.
Okay.
But it's all really just one big form in the end, but you need to assign different parts of that form to other people. And so, over time, we've built a company that's around 100 people, and early days we were all in office, but have transitioned to that remote workforce that you mentioned earlier.
You have a large customer base, so can you cite maybe a few customers that our listeners may know of and probably have used Formstack forms that they didn't know of interacting with those customers?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've definitely got some very large customers. Gannett owns 200 plus newspapers around the U.S. Mm-hmm. And so in Indiana, it's the Indianapolis Star, but then you've got the major newspapers in Cincinnati and other big cities. And so often they will use us to power things like if you want to start a classified ad order, you might use Formstack, or maybe you are participating in a contest for one of the really big professional football teams or hockey teams. You might very well use a Formstack form to enter that contest. And so we've over time had some really big and pretty prominent customers. The Country Music Awards historically has used us in some pretty big ways. We'll actually have, the TV event of the CMAs, and they'll point people to a contest, and our servers all of a sudden get hit really hard because people are filling out something that they're watching, some form that they've watched or seen on TV. And so, some pretty cool names.
Very, very nice. So as you said, you started the company as a fully office-based company, and then it transitions towards mostly and entirely a remote workforce. Why and how did you make the transition?
Yeah, so just like everybody else in 2006, we used an office, and I think relationships have always been very important to us, and so seeing other people, going to lunch together, working together is a lot of fun. Uh-huh. Well, over time, we moved to, I actually had the opportunity to move back to Oklahoma. Our office is based in Indianapolis, but my wife had a job opportunity in Oklahoma, so we were about 20 people at that point, and I thought, you know what? I can figure out how to make this work. I had traveled for work before, and I felt like, something would work out. And at the same time, just a couple months prior to that, we had hired our first developer outside of Indianapolis. And so we were struggling to find development talent, and I happened to know a couple people who lived overseas and were in the market. And so we reached out, interviewed a couple of them, and one of them was a really great fit, and he was in Krakow, Poland. And so all of a sudden, there's just kind of this very early entrance into not all being in the same place. Yeah. And then, over the course of a couple of years, you had, or maybe even the first year, you had a couple of people say, I want to move to San Francisco, or I want to move to Chicago. And we were like, great employees. We don't want to lose them. And so let's support that. And over time, we just kind of opened the door to letting people make that move. And then, after a year or two passed, I think we got to this point where we said, we really need to support what we call remote kind of employees as first-class citizens. Uh-huh. We can't let this be just a thing that happens. We've got to make sure it's a very front-facing, important part of our culture. And even me as CEO, when I lived away from Indianapolis, I've moved back in the past couple of years, it was hard. You've got... you wake up some days and you're like, man, I do not like sitting in my house all day and not getting to physically interact with people, go to lunch. Yeah. And so some of it was just born out of my own desire to make, how do I make a remote environment very friendly to people and still highly relational, because that's important to me. And so one day we kind of drew a line in the sand and said, all right, we're going to be a remote first company, and almost the office is second. We started to think about the office as more like a co-working space. And so you can kind of, when you come in, if you want to come in, you can sit wherever you want, but you don't need to, it doesn't have to be this permanent place. And so, once we started to do that, the just percentages would kick up every year of the number of remote people on our team. And that today looks something like 70% of our team is not even in the state of Indiana. And you've got a decent percentage who are overseas. So we're as far west as California, as far east as Poland, as far north as Canada, as far south as Argentina.
Okay.
And then even in Indianapolis, if you were to walk into our office on a Monday, you might see 3 to 4 people in the office, right, and everybody else is still working remotely.
It's quite interesting because when for our listeners, if you look at Glassdoor's rating for Formstack, you have a 4.8 rating, which is really impressive. And what I heard, it's not even 1% of the companies on Glassdoor make it to that rating, which is awesome by itself. But it's even more impressive for a company that has mostly a remote workforce, because you can really control all the people and the way they interact with each other and the way they relate to the culture in a more controllable way, as you would do when they're in the office. So how do you keep those employees engaged and connected, even though they don't necessarily work physically together?
Yeah. So one of the things we did years ago was we decided to really overfund HR. And so if you look on a percentage basis, we've probably spent more money on HR than you should, I guess, by the books. And so, but one of the things that is really important in a remote workforce is really, really good onboarding. So most of us have had an experience where we start at a new job, and on day one, you show up and you sit down to a desk and you just you're not really sure what's happening. You kind of get introduced to a few people, but then it's this very slow and choppy process. Yeah. And that's even in person. Well, take that experience in a remote world, and you log onto your computer the first day, and you don't have much context. You don't have really good clarity on what's going on. You feel very, very disconnected. Yeah. And so we built a really detailed onboarding process. And so it's, what do you do your first day? Here's the steps of things you should do. How do you get introduced to people? We started putting what we call formigos, so kind of a friend or a peer that you can communicate with in those first 90 days to make sure you're really successful. And that's the beginning of making sure people are in really good shape. But then the other things that we do that are probably different than a lot of organizations. I mean, Slack will be very normal, or HipChat or something like that will be pretty normal in a lot of organizations that are listening to this. But we use that in a very, very heavy way. We use Zoom for video in a very, very heavy way. And so anytime you start a conversation with someone, it's very normal to drop a /Zoom in Slack, and it immediately starts video for both of you, and you're on seeing each other live. And so we like that visual. We like that ability to see each other and kind of build relationship. And that's been kind of important. And so, in fact, we'll give people a pretty hard time if they don't get on the video. We don't we kind of don't accept that, I'll say.
Okay.
Just because we want to make sure people feel like they're in a welcoming relational environment. The other thing that we've had to do over time is get much, much better at written communication. So in an office, it's really easy to walk up to somebody, talk about a subject, right, and in fact, sometimes then people overhear. You walk into a department, the department overhears some of that conversation. And that turns out to be a pretty helpful asset that you don't intend on happening, but that never happens in a remote environment. Yeah. Nothing you say is ever overheard. And so if you write things down and start to document them in a knowledge base of some sort or online, that gets very repeatable. Anybody can read it. It's there forever. And so that makes just a big difference in making sure people know what's going on in the organization and kind of what's happening.
So why do you think, or what makes Formstack's rating on Glassdoor so high compared to other companies that have a pretty strong culture, even though it's maybe office-based or even remote? But what is the secret ingredient at Formstack, would you say?
I mean, I think sometimes it's as simple as just asking for the feedback. And so we pretty proactively ask people on the team to give us feedback, but do that publicly so that other people can see it too. Mm-hmm. And so that's promoted, I think, in the end, a really good asset on Glassdoor, so people can kind of get a sense of how the interviews go. And in fact, one of the things we will do during the interview process is try to ask people for feedback at the end of it, even if they're not getting a job here.
That's very unusual, but very good.
Yeah. So we can learn from that, and we can get better. And, so I think that turns out to be really good. And to me, transparency is really, really important. And so even the negative stuff that does come up over time, we need to learn from that, and we need to get better. And in any organization, you're going to change and morph over time. And so the culture that you try to set day one, doesn't always play out a year or two later in the best way.
So I've heard from people who either work remotely or work at, say, client sites, and they don't really spend time at all or very rarely in an office. And they do have a sense of working together on some projects or tasks with some of the coworkers, but they don't necessarily say it's always purely collaboration. They work on independent tasks, and they may just talk to each other to see what one is doing is going to affect somebody else's tasks, but it's not really collaboration. But mostly what they do miss is the human connection.
Yep.
Right? You may just talk about business, but you don't get to know your coworkers on a more intimate and personal basis. And obviously, there are many comments about technology that is replacing human interactions. I don't really see it that way. I see it as a way to actually get to reach out people that we may never connect before. But my question is, how do you humanize a digital workplace?
Yeah, I think we've seen a couple things happen. One is, I think people are really surprised at the number of Facebook requests and then Instagram followers that they get the day they start. Because the moment someone figures out what that social profile is, you want to interact with them because that's one of your windows into their world that you're not going to get in person.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's a little unnerving for people.
Just talking.
Yeah. But really positive. And so I think you've got a little bit of that. And then the other thing we will do is teams will often build into their maybe weekly meetings, or maybe they'll just do an hour every week where they'll get on video and they'll do trivia, or they will do some sort of, there's a funny phrase one of the teams used called forced fun. So we're going to stop and we're going to force everybody to have fun for an hour and do that together and be social. And so you kind of have to invent some of those new ways to be social. And then the other thing we do to bring that full circle is we get together a couple times a year, one as kind of our teams and our departments, and then one time we all physically get together as an entire company. We call those all hands. And those weeks are intentionally built not about work, but about relationships. And so It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of games. We do vision casting and things like that, but it's not about, let's just get together and do some work together. It's about having fun together. And so you then kind of have these anchors a couple times in the year to say, I remember those times when I'm feeling a little bit alone. Like I work with great people. I got to know them better and better during that time. So those are kind of important ways to keep the relationships high and keep building.
So it's pretty impressive, actually, that you're going to fly everybody in specific location from Poland and Argentina and wherever to be able to spend a day or two together and get to know each other.
Yeah, so it's a pretty heavy spend for us. And, one thing I tell people is they think about remote and they often think, oh, it's a money-saving activity. And for us, we spend just as much money as anyone would in an office. It gets spent at 2 points during the year. We have a little bit of office expense because we do have a couple smaller offices. But then we heavily invest in those all hands so that people can get together.
Right.
But that ultimately, if we were all physically in an office together, we would have a much larger one, and the spend would be about the same.
Yeah.
And so it definitely costs money to get it done, but we think it's really valuable.
Yeah, I guess a way to spin it is it's an investment, not an expense, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
You have to be willing to make the investment in it.
Yeah, and it's hard to do. I think you can get in a mode where it'd be easy to start cutting costs and say, oh, we're gonna cut cost here, and that's going to be something you look at, and it's going to be on the top of your list of easy cuts to make.
Right.
But ultimately, that's going to hurt the organization because it does drive excitement. It drives the relationships. It drives just kind of that energy.
On the website, when you talk about the culture, you talk about you can work from home in your PJs, or you can work from a beach in Thailand. So beyond that flexibility of working pretty much wherever you want and whenever you want, right? Because you're not tied to a specific timetable, during the day. What other unique benefits do you provide to your employees?
Interestingly, while you can work anywhere, we actually still try to keep people on roughly what I'll call U.S. work hours. And so there's some flexibility there. But we want to make sure that at least a chunk of your day is fairly well represented in U.S. time zones. We have not yet had somebody who is consistently, say, in Asia, which is going to be one of the most challenging time zones for us.
Right.
We've got a little more European, so they're getting up and earlier than us, but they're also spending some time on, all at the same time on the computer together. And so I'm trying to think what we do unlimited PTO. We feel like that gives you the ultimate flexibility to figure out, all right, how do I invest my energy well? How do I also take the right time off? We have tried to support kind of maternity and paternity leave at a greater rate, thinking about, one of the unique benefits we have is we get exposed to other cultures more than most, other non-U.S. cultures more than most, because we've got a significant number of people in Canada, a significant number of people in Poland, the UK, in the Netherlands. And so we get to see where they do things differently than us here in the U.S. And we've tried to adopt more and more of those philosophies where appropriate so that we can build a great global workforce. Because for us, I think we see, location is somewhat irrelevant for us. There are great people everywhere around the world, and we want to make sure we can both find them, but also integrate them into our company. When you think of working remotely, it's like, I can do whatever I want. I can work whenever I want. Obviously, you said that you try to align people with the U.S. times, in terms of being able to work together at least for pockets of time. But you have to put in place some metrics and some procedures and processes to make sure that people, even though you give enough flexibility for the people to personally manage their own time, you have to put some metrics in place to make sure that not only it's profitable for the company, but also everybody's pretty much playing fairly in the game, right? Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So we've done a couple things over time. First of all, we built a software product called Gel, and we've actually recently spun that out, and the founder of Formstack has gone on to run that separate from us, but it allows you to set OKRs, so kind of the Google-style goal setting where you have organization goals, and that should drive down to department goals, which drive down to individual goals, and everybody puts in goals every quarter so that we can see what are they trying to accomplish, and we can look back at the end of the quarter and see how they did. That drives a lot of clarity. I think you'll appreciate, we've all been in organizations where goals are just not very clearly set, and it's often very vague, and even reviews are always pretty tough, or you don't get enough information. And so GEL also allows you to, if you think about in a development or engineering world, the daily stand-up is pretty common. So this kind of creates the daily stand-up, or even like a weekly stand-up for a department or a team or the organization. And so you can drop in and say, here's what I'm working on today, here's where I'm running into challenges, here's where I need help. And that's kind of a daily status that everybody gets on the team, but it's also transparent for the whole organization. And so we do that just to make sure everybody has visibility into kind of everything that's going on. There isn't much that's hidden in our organization. We try to keep it either documented in Confluence, a big knowledge base, or in GEL. And so I think that's pretty vital. And then the other thing we've tried to do over time is get people oriented toward what is the big goal, what are we driving toward, and how do we make sure your goals align to that? Sometimes it's variable compensation that helps drive that direction, or sometimes it's team goals and things like that. But I do think it's really important to work through that with people.
You mentioned earlier that sometimes you look at how often people get on Zoom to communicate and collaborate with their coworkers. How far do you go into the monitoring of those type of activity or the lack of activity?
So I don't know that we monitor activity. One of the cultural values we have had historically here is one called communicate status. So if you think about your Twitter status, let's say, in the early days of Twitter, it was I'm eating lunch, or these very basic kind of updates on what's going on in your world. Well, we want to make sure that we hire people who don't mind keeping very visible what they're doing. And so people who don't reach out to you on a pretty regular basis via Slack or Zoom or whatever, eventually wash out of the organization.
Okay.
When you're trying to pull information out of people and pull them into things, that doesn't work very well here at all. You need people who are actively wanting to communicate, want to participate in group conversations in Slack or Zoom, and ask for help, let people know what they're working on. And so those people will tend to succeed much more here at Formstack. But that key value makes a huge, huge difference. You keeping people in the loop of what's going on works really well. If you don't, you'll tend to, you start to wonder, like, what are they working on? I don't know how to help them. And that's of course, especially bad when they disappear for days or weeks at a time. Right. And a project deadline's coming up and you think everything's going okay, and then they're way off.
Yeah. Would you say that the fact that you have a large remote workforce, I don't know if it's forces, but do you think that it encourages people to communicate more effectively than if they were all together in the same physical space?
Oh, I think there's something to that. One of the things I always tell people is there's a trade-off in a remote environment. And on one hand, in an office environment, collaboration is relatively easy. Mm-hmm. It's easy to walk up and chat with somebody, grab a group of people, and just jump on a whiteboard and go.
Right.
What you lose in a remote environment is some of that collaboration, but you often gain significant productivity. And so in the end, you've got people who probably spend a lot more time working, a lot more focused time. They're less distracted. And so I think you've always just got to be aware of how do we then recreate collaboration, and how do we keep people leaning back that direction? Because, again, the productivity tends to end up being not easy, but it happens more naturally. The collaboration is more challenging.
Do you use any type of data to measure some of the things, some of the initiatives that try to put in place, and what works or what doesn't work?
I think so some things we've done, well, cross-functional teams have become really important in the organization. So again, where it's probably easier to make collaboration work in an office environment, we've had to force, in a good way, but force cross-functional teams. And so you'll tend to have a team that has a designer on it, and maybe a product manager, and then engineering, but they're relatively small teams, 5 to 7 people. It's a lot easier to keep up with a group of 7 people. It's a lot easier to know what's going on, know where challenges are happening, and that tends to happen a lot more in the organization. You need to find how do you take 100 people and make it more like 7, a bunch of small teams, being effective, and so that also allows us to create these initiatives that become easier to measure. Not easy, but easier. So we can, for instance, we've got a team that is focused on a product and engineering team that is focused on a workflow product for us. So it's relatively easy to say, is the workflow kind of line of business growing? How quickly is it growing? That allows us to see, can we fund that more? Should we fund it less? If we had this just big list of projects that this big development team took on, it'd be very difficult to know which things were working well, which things were not. This allows us to keep a little bit more focus and measure. And I'd say we probably, as an organization, and maybe I hadn't thought about it until you asked, but maybe because we're remote, we've relied on measurement more and more and more over time. And so we'll try to force measure things that probably aren't always appropriate to measure, like how do I measure design or how do I measure things like that. I know we probably take it too far sometimes, but we try to measure as much as possible.
Would you say that you spend a lot of time trying to think of how to run a business differently because of a large remote workforce? Or is it pretty much just like natural and sort of organic, where you just try and do?
I think for years it was probably, how do we do this appropriately? Are there roles that are better remote versus not? And so for a time where we were building out sales, what we had found was sales is actually really, really, what's weird about sales is historically remote sales is very normal. Like that's one of those departments that historically has been spread across the country. You've got field salespeople everywhere. Well, oddly enough, in our organization, what we found is more sales reps together is actually really, really effective. And so we've tried to group them better over time. And part of that is just you learn the product faster, you overhear each other. So much of sales is this constant coaching and getting it better and motivating yourself every day. And so having that physical group around you is easier to do that. But I'd say at this point, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, we're now 6 years into this. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about how do we do this differently. Sometimes I still have to convince people that it's, even when we've talked to investors or potential partners or customers, they think it's weird sometimes, and I'll have to kind of reconvince them. But at this point, I almost stop arguing it and I just say, it just works. Like I don't need to explain it to you. You'll see the company grow and see the company get better, and we'll produce just as well as anybody else. And so, it's become less of an issue over time.
So earlier you mentioned that you learn from some of the benefits or some of the expectations or aspirations that some of your employees in Europe have, for instance, and they may see things a little differently from US or Canadian workers, for instance. How do you manage the multicultural aspect of your workforce? Is it something that is pretty intuitive, or do you actually spend time trying to educate about cultural differences between different countries?
Yeah, I don't think we do a great job, but we sure try to think about that. So during our big all hands last year, we all met up in Chicago, and we had an entire day or it was probably a half day, where we asked one person for every country represented, except for the U.S., we asked somebody to represent it and kind of describe the culture. And so it was often very humorous and like, here's how we do things differently than, maybe in the U.S., and here's some interesting facts, here's some interesting history. So we've done a little bit of that. And then, I had a conversation with somebody just probably about a month ago, and I said, help me understand, how are our country cultures different? Like, what are your observations about how things are different? And one of the things I heard was that this won't be like super shocking to most of us in the U.S., but that we are not nearly as empathetic as some other cultures. And so I had to step back and say, all right, how do we think about being more empathetic? And And in fact, sometimes I probably think of ourselves as relatively empathetic, but that there's a cultural gap. And so my my middle on empathy, it looks different than the middle for someone else.
Yeah.
And so I'd say we're trying to make that more and more a part of our culture, because we do want that to be a part of the future as a global workforce, and just an appreciation for people around the world.
Obviously, working remotely is not for everyone. Right, you need to have a high sense of accountability. Right, you need to be able to be a self-starter and be able to work without any supervision, someone looking at behind your back what you're doing. Are you looking for specific skills or behaviors or mindsets when you hire people? And what's the interview process like?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, we actually transitioned the interview process to be completely remote. In the early days of remote, we still asked people to come in for interviews, but eventually we said, all right, I think we can do this completely remote.
It can be expensive if you have someone flying from Europe or from South America.
Yeah, absolutely. And those first European hires, we actually had them come to the U.S. for 2 weeks and try to just make sure that we got them involved in the culture. But one of the things, I'm trying to think, some of the things we look for, first of all, how do people just interact with us on video? Yeah. That's a pretty basic skill, and you'll be surprised at how often people are very awkward on video, or they'll try to start the conversation without including video. There's some basics like, you do recording of podcasts, microphone is really, really important in that audio quality. And so you'll just see how people adjust to that. And sometimes that's a pretty early sign of, this is probably not going to work. They're not as in tune with the basics of, say, video conferencing. And so you're looking for some of that. We'll tend to ask some kind of stupid cultural questions like what's your spirit animal and hokey things like that to help just see what kind of humor people will bring to the equation, because you need to be able to relate to people over the computer, and that takes a little bit of effort, and that takes some skill sometimes. A background in a remote company is a super helpful thing for us, and it's especially helpful not just because it proves to us they are interested in remote, but it often is a really great springboard, because what we'll often have is this experience where somebody worked for a remote company, they come to us and they're like, wow, this is a very relational remote company. Whereas in the old remote company I was in, we talked via, say, Slack only, or it was all via, Basecamp or Project-esque kind of communications. Yeah. And so it's often a really big upgrade for them to be able to be in a more relational environment. And so I will say that it's good to see people who are just coming out of college or have never been in a remote workforce. It can be challenging, because you've got to learn some new skills. You've got to learn these patterns in your life, like how do I get away from the computer? How do I get out of the house still? And sometimes that can be a challenge for people.
How many fresh college graduates do you have?
It's probably, here in Indiana, we support the Orr Fellowship, and so that is a source of some recent college graduates. Otherwise, we probably tend away from just first job college graduates. Yeah. Even a few years in is I think more normal, but it's probably, I don't know, 10% of the workforce or something like that.
So what would be maybe 3 or 4 tips that or things that you've learned, lessons that you've learned, mistakes that you've done, that you would share with people who are either considering working for a company remotely, or even starting a company or expanding their current company to more of a remote workforce?
So for me, the most valuable thing, and this was somewhat by accident, but the most valuable thing that happened for me was that I personally was remote. And so I actually don't know exactly how you would take an in-office environment and try to make it remote. Or if you were going to do that, I would very much force your leadership to at least take some time and be remote. Mm-hmm. Push them out and say, do not come into the office for a month and leave the state, leave the city, whatever, so that they can experience some of that on their own. Otherwise, you don't have the empathy for what does this feel like, and how is it different from being in the office? And I think that's vital. You need to create some sort of your own understanding. And that's me. Like I learned by doing, and so I wouldn't learn very well by just being in the office hoping that remote is all working out. They would definitely become second-class citizens in that case. And so I'd say that's important. Documenting vision becomes really, really important. Again, you pick some of that culture and vision and values up when you're in an office environment. It is much harder to pick that up. And so you need to write it down. You need to repeat it over and over again. And maybe earlier than you do, earlier in the stage of the company than you do in an office environment. So that was something I'd say within the first year that became like violently apparent, was just people's confusion about where we were going and what we were trying to accomplish. And so we had to kind of get that documented quickly. And then I guess the other thing I'd say is, the mistake early on was not forcing ourselves to learn how to collaborate faster. It took many years for someone to have this idea. So there's this project that we were working on. It was a data project, and it had lasted way too many months. And one day it kind of came to this head, and it was like, we have got to get this done in the next 3 weeks. And so my suggestion was, everybody fly to the same location, sit together, and that's going to speed this project up. And someone said, well, why don't we just open up Zoom, turn the camera on all day? You can mute it. You don't have to, it's not like you have to talk all day, but just if you want to speak to somebody, you unmute, say, hey, I'm running into this issue. Mm-hmm. And they did that for 3 weeks together. Wow. And it was all of a sudden this new moment in collaboration. You can actually just sit together and spend time together without physically being together. And it's actually fairly natural. And so I think forcing ourselves into collaboration earlier would have been valuable.
It's interesting. We're getting close to the end of the podcast, and usually at this stage, I like to ask some fun and personal questions.
Yeah.
What is, if you were to pick one historical figure, someone famous, to invite to dinner, who would that be?
Yeah, historical figure.
Or someone famous.
So, yeah. I think one of the things that I learned a lot from over the years is mentors. And so, my mind quickly goes to who are people who are 10 steps ahead of me, 100 steps ahead of me that I can learn from. And so you've got some very, respected leaders who have built really, really big companies like Mark Benioff and Salesforce, or obviously you've got the basics like Steve Jobs and things like that. And so my mind definitely goes there. But I'd probably go to the slightly less high profile person and would likely find the quieter, don't even have somebody real specifically in mind, but just what's the company that's doing $100 million in revenue or has 1,000 employees, but you don't know the guy's name or the girl's name. Whoever's running it is a little more obscure. And so I'd take one historic example who's been extremely helpful in my education as a CEO was Gail Goodman. She ran Constant Contact for years, and so I actually got to spend a little bit of time with her a few years ago, and it was just very, very enlightening. And so, again, I don't have that next person, but I think finding someone in that light who is not quite as well known.
If you had the ability to pick one spot in the world to work remotely for 1 year, where would you go?
Oh, 1 year. Well, London is my favorite city in the world, and I got to live there a few years. I'd definitely go back. So that's an easy one. I suppose, though, what I'd really love to do is push myself a little bit. And so let's go to Asia. I think that's a good new locale. I'd probably pick a place like Singapore. So you've got, this mix of Asia and Western culture, but you can also get to the broader, everywhere else in Asia. I think I'd love to experience all the things I don't know about Asia. I'm from the West and I've lived in Europe, but that's still the West. And so right. I think expanding my horizons, and so I'd probably pick Singapore, and forces you into a very different time zone, very different culture.
What's your favorite vacation spot?
London is definitely it. I love the mix of cultures. When we lived in London, our kids were in a school with 40 different first languages, and that's just, to us, my wife and I, very cool and great opportunity, and very different faith backgrounds, and and just kind of an amazing place to meet lots of people.
It's very multicultural. So, well, let's pick one food that you ate the most, or did you enjoy the most in London. It's very cosmopolitan, so you have a lot of choices for food.
Oh yeah, well, turns out over time, fish and chips became not the number one dish, and the curry did. And I'd say we got introduced to Indian food in general, and so Indian food is by all means a huge part of our life now, and that's definitely a favorite, some sort of curry or korma or something like that.
Yeah, that's funny. I would say the same. When I used to travel overseas quite a lot as well, every time I was in London, I would go just to an Indian place because it's safe, first of all, right? You pretty much, you can get wrong.
Yeah.
And British food is not necessarily the greatest either. Anyways, what type of music do you listen to? What energizes you?
Yeah. I have this weird mix of current pop music, and people laugh at me for it. And so, in the old days, it was probably Miley Cyrus and Taylor Swift and, Imagine Dragons these days, something like that. But people always make fun of me for listening to the pop music. And then, my faith background is as a Christian. And so I actually listen to a lot of kind of Christian and worship music, and that's a really important part of my life and how I wake up every day and think about kind of how I'm going to tackle the day.
And what would be the thing that people would not expect you to do that you would do outside of work?
I probably don't come across as anywhere near athletic, and I've not done this as much recently, but running has been an important part of my kind of out of work life. And so I've run just one marathon, but done a handful of half marathons. It's a really, really good way for me to get out, clear my mind, and just get rid of the junk that gets built up in there.
Right. It's a good way, yeah. What would be the last word of advice or wisdom that you would like to give our listeners?
The most valuable thing I ever heard was in my first year of this job. And I heard someone say, you have got to live out the values that are inside of you. You cannot build a company based on what you see someone else doing and then try to emulate them. Mm-hmm. You don't know why they're motivated to build the company the way that they are. And so you need to start with your own values, start with your own, why am I here? What am I created to do? And go after that. And that's going to serve you so much better than trying to be the next person that you see around you.
What are Formstack's values?
So a couple of really important values. I get to work on solving problems. So we always hire problem solvers, and that's an important part of our interview process is, can I give you a problem and know that I'm not going to handhold you to get to the answer, and I'm just going to say, go after it. You're going to solve it different than I am, and that's totally cool. And I'm not going to give you a lot of direction. In fact, if you ask for too much direction, you'll probably get frustrated here.
Okay.
I think that's a really important one.
It's a good one.
Being transparent so people know what are you thinking and what are you working on. And I think that just builds trust, and trust is so important in an environment like this.
It's interesting, but transparency is a common theme that comes back every so often on the podcast, and I've done a few other interviews here in Indianapolis, Max Yoder, Jeb Banner, Mike Kelly, for instance, just staying here in Indy, and many of them, actually all of them, brought up the needs for transparency.
So the way I think about it is, part of transparency is just when I share, it's everything. It's when I share data and maybe overshare data with you, it helps make you smarter about how the business works. Or when I share how am I feeling about something and I'm truly transparent about it, it builds this trust because people know that, I as a leader, I'm going to screw up a bunch of things over time, and I'm going to make people mad. I'm going to make them sad. And, I'm going to hire people and let people go that just cause drama or cause frustration. So I'm going to screw up a lot. But if people at the most basic level know, you know what though, I trust that he's trying to do this right and he's trying to make the right decisions, and over time I've built that trust. It kind of covers a lot of sins.
Yeah.
People can get over when at the basic, core moment they know they're cared about, they're valued. That fixes a lot.
I would agree with that. What's the way to follow you and Formstack on social media?
Yeah, you can at Formstack both on Twitter, Instagram. I'm at Chris Byers on both Twitter and Instagram, and so easy ways to keep up.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Chris, for being with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. It's been great.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.